Hi everybody. I'm Jerry Wise, and today we're talking about what is emotional fusion. And I believe the more we learn about fusion and too much togetherness in relationships, the more we know how to navigate ourselves in relationships. What we know in family systems, and say a Bowen family systems approach, is fusion and togetherness is the main way we adapt to anxiety in the system. And anxiety in relationships, anxiety in us, because fusion and togetherness creates more calmness. It also costs a lot because we then de-self, we then feel immature, we then feel like kids, we then don't feel like full adults when we fuse and when we're enmeshed with other people. So let me tell you or share with you some characteristics about what it feels like to be fused. Well, I think one of the best overarching terms is codependency. If you have a codependent relationship with someone, you're fused. And a lot of people understand codependency. When we have relationships in which others want us to make decisions for them or for us, meaning for the relationship, not just for self, but for us and for them, then we have some fusion. Particularly if someone's under functioning, then we'll be fused with them and feel pressured to make decisions for them, to fix them, and those types of things. When we are fused, affirmation and praise and criticism means far too much to us. That creates a problem for us because we're hungry for the affirmation, starving for that praise, and we also feel destroyed when we get criticized. That's when you know fusion or enmeshment is happening. Another description of fusion is when we think and act alike. Or another characteristic is when we have a we-they dynamic that's at work. Whenever you're in a relationship and you have a we-they, then oftentimes there's fusion or enmeshment going on. We're here and they're there. And that we have camps, gangs, a grouping of people, a gaggle of people that have all decided something about that gaggle of people. The we-they is fusion. It means we're not self-differentiated. Fusion also creates the problem of taking things personally and others taking things personally. If I tend to take things personally in a relationship, I'm probably fused and enmeshed. If they take things personally, we're probably fused. So that's another sign of this fusion. Another characteristic is we may engage in prolonged polarized debates. And that polarization of debates can be about religion, about politics, about work debates, all kinds of things that we engage in political debates and those polarized debates. We have those with our families, at work, and we just can't seem to get disengaged from those debates. We can't step away from the debate because we feel caught in it. And I'm sure some of you have had that experience. You go back for Christmas or Thanksgiving to your family, and you're engaged in these very highly charged debates that come up. Now, debating can be okay, but we want to do that from a point of self-differentiation, not from fusion. That we can't pull ourselves out of it. We must prove a point. We must change the other person. They're trying to prove a point. They're trying to change us. That's the enmeshment or fusion. Also, fusion will be characterized by when we focus on who has the power. Is it them or is it me? When there's a power struggle, then we often have fusion. Because if I'm self-differentiated, I have my own power and I see myself as empowered. And I don't need to decide who has the power and who doesn't have the power. I have my own power. Fusion also makes it difficult to tolerate intense feelings, and we act automatically to relieve them. When we're fused and we have these intense reactions or feelings, we then may do things to try to bring that anxiety down. And we'll do that automatically because we don't like the conflict. We don't like the tension. Fusion also requires us to avoid confrontation or sharing an I position or a self-differentiated position. If you cannot clearly state for yourself where you're at what you feel, how you believe about a certain situation, then probably you are enmeshed or fused. And if we begin to identify these things, that can reframe it and also help us feel better and start to on a road of more self-differentiation. Fusion may also pressure us to be confrontational with others, to push back because the fusion is intense versus a dialogue, or as I've used many times, a tennis court analogy where they're on their side of the tennis court, I'm on my side of the tennis court, and we're interacting with one another. And the reason why we will be confrontational with others is because we're trying to push away against that fusion. And so we'll be confrontational. I remember a client recently had a situation where he just was feeling sucked in by a higher boss that he had at his work. And she was being kind of shaming and kind of discounting like his father would have been. And he's enmeshed with her. He's not very solid in terms of his own self. And then he then gets reactive to push her back because he can't handle the fusion. And I'm going to be talking in other videos about how we can resolve that fusion better. And we don't have to push back on it out of reactivity, because that pushing back doesn't resolve it. In many ways, it only keeps the status quo and keeps that same equilibrium in the relationship. Peter Titleman, in his book, Emotional Cutoff, he describes expressions of fusion. And I like the 4 that he mentions. Number 1, acting as if one can read the other's mind. Number 2, speaking or acting for the other. Number 3, automatically expressing emotional, social, or physical responses that are reactions to expressed or unexpressed behavior or feelings of another family member or others. And number 4, adopting or living out automatically a family belief, tradition, a lifestyle, or a role that you play in the family. Those are all characteristics of fusion. And if we can begin to understand what are the characteristics of fusion, we can begin to take a look at those and begin to resist them and to change those. If we are much more aware of what fusion and enmeshment feels like and the expressions of fusion, we can begin to identify and change our behavior, and our feelings will follow. One of the reasons that I have these short videos about these little tips and about learning about these things is because I used to go and stay on the Hotel Queen Mary. I have not too long ago been able to stay on there. Now with us staying at home, it's a little harder to do that. But I always wondered, how do you turn an ocean liner? And in fact, Steve Strauss, I think it was a USA Today article online, and he talked about the trim tab analogy, which I've used for a long time. I just didn't call it the trim tab analogy. And I used to remember how long it would take for the Hotel Queen Mary, which is a great big ocean liner, was the largest ocean liner in the world at the time. Also the fastest ship on the ocean during World War II. It's now in Long Beach, California, and you can stay on it as a hotel. I loved going there. And I always thought, how do they turn this big ship? And of course, we all know, well, they have a rudder. So they just turn the wheel and it turns the rudder. Well, the ship is going by so fast and with so much pressure on the rudder that you can't just turn the wheel and turn the rudder because there's so much pressure on the rudder. You don't just turn it like that. That's a big rudder. So what they have is a little trim tab on the back of it. And by the way, I'm not a sailor. I'm not an ocean-going, knowledgeable person about nautical things. But there's a little trim tab on the back, and they begin to change the trim tab, which is the very back end of the rudder, and it's a smaller thing you have to turn. And so it turns one way, and that assists the rudder to be turned in another direction. And I consider these videos as changing that trim rudder, so we can change the bigger rudder and change the ship from fusion and enmeshment to self-differentiation. So what do we want to do? We want to resist the fusion in our lives and address our anxiety and our fear, and not just try to resolve it by fusing, enmeshment, giving in, those kinds of things. So address the anxiety and fears and not fuse to create calmness in us and in the system. And one author puts that as a maturity detour. We do a maturity detour when we just give in or when we get reactive, when the anxiety is high, so that we'll get back to calmness again. That's a giving in to the system. While it does create momentary calmness, it doesn't change the system. And so we want to create that calmness in us and in the system, but at the price of self and price of self-differentiation. So I wanted to share these thoughts with you today. I appreciate you watching today, and I hope you have a great day.